One of the most celebrated songs in history, this classical piece truly embraces its name in the history books as a classic. Written by Ludwig von Beethoven, it was described as fate knocking on the door. It is a legend among classical music, as is its composer. Life was not a happy endeavor for young Beethoven. From the time that he could crawl, Beethoven's father saw an unmatched musical talent within his son. As Beethoven grew older, his father soon became obsessed, desiring to turn his son into the next Mozart. While a wonderful music enthusiast, Beethoven's father was also a very violent person, often coming home drunk only to abuse his children. Beethoven was only 4 years old when his father first began to force him into playing music, shutting the child in his rooms for hours a day and forcing him to work his fingers bloody on the violin.
I think his father was really hard on him. But I think music was in him already.
When Beethoven reached the age of 17, he left his German hometown of Bonn for Vienna in the hopes of studying with his idol Mozart. But nearly as soon as he reached Vienna, he was put back to Germany by the death of his beloved mother. When Beethoven later returned, Mozart was no longer alive, but Beethoven instead became the pupil of many other famous musicians. Joseph Haydn gave the young man lessons in compositions. Johann Albrechtsberger gave him lessons in counterpoint and fugue. The esteemed Salieri trained him in vocal writing. All of his teachers' qualities influenced him greatly and are seen throughout his later works. Young Beethoven slowly began to replace the undying Mozart, and his music filled halls and homes with concertos and sonatas. Slowly, he came to be accepted as the most important performing pianist of his generation. And that was only the beginning. The first symptoms appeared in 1776. Symptoms of the worst possible disease that any musical composer could have. Symptoms of deafness. For many years, Beethoven tried to keep his secret, shutting himself away and avoiding contact with any one person. His musical appearances stalled to almost nothing. The up-and-coming composer had disappeared from the musical scene. In 1801, he wrote the heartbreaking letter to his friends and family. "Your Beethoven is very unhappy," he wrote. "You must know that the best part of me, my hearing, has become very weak. How sad is my life! I'm deaf! Had my profession been any other, things might still be bearable. But if it is, then my situation is terrible." And yet, it was this tragedy in his life that sparked the first inclines of romanticism in him. The tragedy of his deafness had a profound effect on Beethoven. He could no longer hear the beauty in his music, and that was a terribly sad thing. His works began to reflect his mood more than his genius. For example, the Lario within his Piano Sonata in D, and the entirety of his Sonata Pathétique. Today we express these works as simply classical pieces of music, but in truth, there's so much more. When Beethoven began to write, these pieces were revolutionary. He became the first truly free composer after receiving a paid position in which the only condition of his employment was that he stay on the grounds and compose whatever it was that his heart felt. However, this was a particularly sad time within Beethoven's life, the time of which he wrote a letter to his brothers, a will of things that must be carried out after Beethoven's suicide. And yet, it was his music that saved him. Romanticism in music was, at the time, unthinkable. Beethoven lived in the classical era, a period still focused primarily on musical theory, occasionally sacrificing beauty and quality for one right note over another. Tonality was never a forethought, and by some, the music was frequently described as boring or clinical. And yet, Beethoven did not see it in this way. He was consumed by the feelings that one could express when they played or listened to music. He was enthralled by the idea that music could be perfect to the ear while being imperfect on the page. He reinvented the accidentals. No longer was an odd extra sharp or flat placed only when keys changed, but instead they were throughout his works, flats to make a major key tonality, and sharps that express the deepest kind of melancholy. He was changing music. I am not satisfied with my work up to the present time. From today, I mean to take a new road. Up until this point, Beethoven had been innovating in ways that were deemed unthinkable. But with this new declaration, his works became inconceivable. People flocked from all over Europe to hear his music. He wrote the Symphony No. 3, entitled Eroica, which is still regarded as one of the most revolutionary musical pieces ever written. He wrote the immortal Symphony No. 5. Beethoven's music began to reflect his spirit and his soul. It was truly revolutionary, for it seemed as if Beethoven had officially become a rebel.
He changed the writing, the style of writing. He pushed the parameters of musical expression, and the other artists had to respond to that.
The following is a sample of Pachelbel's Canon, another popular and often praised piece composed during the height of the Baroque era. Listen to its musical structure if you can, and try to note some of the patterns within the notes and the rhythms. More than that, attempt to imagine what you feel as you listen to this music. This piece, though popular and very beautiful, is widely regarded as one of the most boring classical pieces to play throughout the musical community. The chord structure remains entirely the same throughout the piece, except for the last two measures of song, and the rhythms also stay the same in the cello and viola parts, remaining a steady distribution of whole and half notes throughout the piece, with the occasional quarter note thrown in. The violin part alters between half notes, quarter notes, and eighth notes, but all the parts flow at the same speed, so when the cellos have a whole note, the violins usually will follow with a half. It is a perfect ratio that almost never changes, leading to a rather predictable piece of music.
But for sure, he was turning away from the constrictions of the classical language and striving to find something with more freedom, more passion. So we hear classical music that is quite self-contained in a sense, still with passion and still with great expression. But we hear in Beethoven, for the first time, we start to hear this music becoming much more forefront. The intensity and the feeling in the music was no longer held behind a clear facade or a self-controlled facade, but it was more worn on the heart sleeve. It's quite possible to follow his influence, even so much as when the history of music turns away from the past language in order to create a new language. There's still a reaction, a cause, and an effect that can be traced.
Now listen to this piece written by Beethoven. Notice how all the parts are very different, but still work cohesively together to form an exciting, changing, and entirely unpredictable piece of music. As you listen, notice how either all of the sections of instruments are either perfectly together or are all playing very different things. In this exciting and emotional piece, Beethoven expresses great emotions of melancholy, joy, and sadness, always varying and sometimes combining all such things into one part of the piece. His movements are perfected, and his love of music is great. One of the most important musical critics of the time period, E.T.A. Hoffmann, once wrote, quote, "Beethoven's music sets in motion the lover of fear, of awe, of horror, of suffering, and awakens just that infinite longing which is the essence of Romanticism. He is accordingly a completely romantic composer."
We are where we are in our exploration of a musical language because of where we have been. We are where we are because of Beethoven.